And we're back in the studio like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Saturday evening here with me in New York. We finally had a nice day. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Today marks 34 years since one of those legendary nights that the sport of boxing always returns to. And in this particular instance, it's not that it was an all-time great fight. It's a good fight. It was a good battle between two all-timers. But it's more the miracle that allowed these two guys to, in some ways, cross the space-time continuum to face one another. There are certain historical fantasy fights which never could have taken place simply because the two guys were too far apart in age. Ali could never have fought Tyson, even careers. But Ali only had one career, and even that one career went on way, way too long. But that's a whole other story. 34 years ago today, Evander Holyfield made a successful defense of his undisputed world heavyweight title. I think it was his first title defense, if I'm not mistaken, defeating the former champion who had lost his title already 17 years prior. Like 1991 is 34 years ago. George Foreman unfortunately passed around a month ago. But George had lost his title 17 years before 1991. He lost it on October 29, 1974 to his rival and future BFF, Muhammad Ali, the only time that George was ever stopped. George Foreman, 81 fights, 76-5. His last fight against Shannon Briggs, spoiler alert, he won the fight. The judges gave it to Briggs. I think everyone in the sport just wanted George to step away and retire and enjoy retirement. Well, that's what ended up happening. But only 5 men ever beat George Foreman. Shannon Briggs, Tommy Morrison, Jimmy Young, Muhammad Ali, and the real deal, Evander Holyfield, on the night of April 19th, 1991. But when I talk about historical fantasy fights, few people, if this fight had never taken place, let's just say that Evander had beaten James Buster Douglas in a return match, or let's reboot The Matrix and Mike Tyson somehow fights Evander, April 19, 1991. Nobody would have been clamoring for a fantasy fight, or really there wouldn't be that much discussion about, I wonder what would have happened between George Foreman and Evander Holyfield. Well, the Foreman that Evander fought 34 years ago tonight was not the fucking dreadnought of the 1973 era George Foreman. He was slower, he was funnier and cuddlier, he was more likable, he was not the kind of intimidating personality. He went out of his way to be nice to people. He was great on the talk shows, the younger David Letterman and Carson and the very young Jay Leno, and he used to go on those shows and make everybody laugh and pretend that he wasn't still an absolute killer in the ring. It was like he was lulling people into a false sense of security. Now, Evander Holyfield wasn't going to go for any of that nonsense. But Foreman, it's incredible that the world got to see this fight. So many different things had to happen in the precise sequence for George Foreman to get another shot at the title. And then 3.5 years later, when he should have already been retired, getting another shot at the title and making the most of that. But the fantasy fight, for real, it's a good enough representation. It's not at all how the fight would have gone if you take the 1973 Foreman against Evander. Now, Evander could have won. It's not like 73 Foreman, the Foreman that smoked Smoking Joe Frazier. It's not like that guy just walks through Evander Holyfield. There's nothing in Evander Holyfield's entire career, even fighting bigger, more talented guys. In the case of Riddick Bowe, Riddick Bowe was a unicorn. He was a super freak. Riddick Bowe lost one fight in his career to Evander Holyfield in their second fight. And there were some people that thought that Riddick did enough to win that decision. I think it was a good decision. But the point is, that Evander stood up, even when he was well past it. He stood up to Lennox Lewis twice. Lewis couldn't put him away. And the third fight with Bo got a stoppage, but Evander still was probably not 100% from the heart issues. And man, that was a grueling fight. I think that prime Evander versus prime George, I think George has the edge, but Evander was the kind of fighter, a great boxer who could take a hell of a shot, had a great motor, and could hit like hell. That's not, Evander Holyfield is a matchup problem for any fighter who ever lived. There's nobody you could say, well, Joe Louis would be. No, Evander did everything fundamentally well in the ring. We know his will to win was second to none. He wasn't afraid to mix it up. He could outbox you, but he could also slug with you. And we saw that in the Tyson fight in '96 when everybody thought, not the ear bite, the first one, when everybody thought Evander was going to go out there and just, they knew he was going to come to fight. He wasn't going to run away. He wasn't going to, the joke with, Buster Mathis Jr. made it to the third round with a life raft because he was holding on to Tyson for 3 rounds, and that's how he lasted. It was Ali's old trainer, the fight doctor, Ferdy Pacheco, who said this, one of the great lines in the history of boxing commentary. They're like, well, Buster Mathis Jr. made it to the third round against Tyson. Yeah, he made it with a life raft. He's like grabbing onto him and not letting him throw any punches. But George retired in 1976 after losing a really tough fight to a guy who is historically underrated, Jimmy Young, kind of the Terrence Crawford of his day. Not as good, relatively speaking, as Terrence Crawford, but what I mean is that Jimmy Young was a counterpuncher. He was not a tremendous hitter. He was not a big, booming puncher. He was a guy who looked for openings, and he was really good at making his opponents look really bad and sometimes stupid. And George fought a different fight against him than he had against Ali and Zaire, but he got outmaneuvered and he kind of gassed, and he was really lucky to even hear the final bell. Young was very close to stopping George a couple of times. George didn't quit. He was still winging in the 14th and 15th rounds, but Young was really good in that era, and he gave Ali all he could handle. All that, spoiler alert again, maybe the dullest heavyweight title fight this side of, and I'm sorry to say this, Max Baer versus James J. Braddock. That is a 15-round snooze fest. They had to kind of sex it up for the movie, but that is a really dull fight. Sorry. But George Foreman retired from boxing with the 2 losses in '76, and he made his comeback in '86. And he wasn't that old. And when you look at George's, the first part of his career, he didn't really take any bad beatings. You could argue, not even the Ali fight, that the Jimmy Young fight was the worst beating he took. But then you say, Young didn't really hit hard. Young was not a guy who leveraged his punches. He didn't like taking unnecessary risks. Jimmy Young was a cautious, safety-first kind of fighter. He's very clever. He was a smart boxer. He knew how to keep distance. He knew how to keep his opponents at bay. Nobody likes getting peppered with 5 or 6 shots in a row. Ali sure as hell didn't like that, and that was a very sloppy and awful fight. The Ali-Young fight, depending on who you ask, well, Ali won it easily, Young didn't do anything, or, well, Young won it easily, Ali didn't do anything. That's the kind of fighter that Jimmy Young was. You almost couldn't tell who was winning the fight. He was a really good boxer. But Foreman's comeback was looked upon as a novelty act. It was a joke. He's funny. He's fat. All of this stuff. And his final record of 76-5 was, you hate to say it was padded because they were real fighters and some former top contenders and young prospects who didn't quite have the careers they should have, like Tony Fulalangi was a knockout artist, but by the time George got to him, it wasn't competitive. But George needed something. He was running low on funds, and that's why, he became the youth minister and a pastor, the preacher. That was the joke when he fought Cooney, the preacher versus the puncher. How is Foreman not the puncher? Come on, even Mike Tyson said George might be the greatest puncher in the history of the sport, but he was the preacher? Like, that's what we're going to talk about George Foreman first, that he was a preacher and not a guy with deadly power in both hands? But Foreman had a lot of not that impressive showings in his comeback. And it wasn't just that he was old or that he was rusty. He just looked like a guy who was just trying to make a buck, and that he wasn't serious, even though he told people, I want a shot at the title. I want to redeem myself for what happened against, as he put it, what happened against Muhammad all those years ago. You know, that was a fight I thought I was going to win, and I feel like I should have won. And, you know, as he said, did you like Ali? He says, no, I hated him. I got to Zaire, and I had the title, and I left Zaire without the title. He stole my title. And obviously that was a big laugh line. I think he said that on Letterman. The key thing in George's comeback, though, there were two very important things, obviously, to set up this particular incredible night of April 19, 1991. George Foreman was sent out to fight Jerry Cooney in what amounted to, and they didn't use this word, the preacher versus the puncher, it was an eliminator. In other words, in theory, because, and this is very important, Mike Tyson had not fought Buster Douglas yet. It's a critical point because the timeline and everything doesn't really match if you don't understand that Mike Tyson was still undefeated, undisputed, and as much of a dominant force as the George Foreman who smashed Joe Roman, Ken Norton, and a fantastic all-timer in Joe Frazier. Smashed all three of those guys, in the immortal words of John Sterling, back to back to back, and a belly to belly to belly. 5 rounds total in 3 fights. And Joe Roman was a tough son of a gun, and he came to fight. He's throwing leather. I mean, it was a good thing the fight ended when it did. He would have gotten seriously injured. And Norton, you could still see those uppercuts sending Norton. Ken was lucky he didn't end up in the first row on some of those uppercuts. But you look at the way that the Cooney fight was presented to us. It was an eliminator, and the idea was, I don't know what the idea and why they even did it. I feel like they were hoping that the people, the powers that be in the sports, the Lou Dubas, the Bob Arams, the promoters, the Don Kings, they were hoping that George would win. Because Cooney had already lost twice. He lost to Holmes, and Cooney's one of those guys, he seemed to lose winnable fights. And the worst thing you can say about a championship caliber fighter, I shouldn't say that, one of the worst things you can say is they lost a couple of fights you say they should have won that fight. They had the talent, and it seemed like they had the will to win, and they just didn't. And Jerry Cooney should have been able to beat Michael Spinks. He should have. Cooney was, at least in theory, closer to his prime than he would when he fought George. And, man, Spinks just really kind of manhandled him, even though Jerry was so much bigger. If Jerry had beaten George Foreman, he wasn't going to get a title shot with Tyson, but there were people who were already excited just about the theory, the idea, if George gets by Cooney. Because it was understood, Mike Tyson wasn't going to lose to James Douglas. James Douglas was another guy, an enormous prospect, huge talent, but he hadn't really actualized. It seems crazy to think a guy getting title shots didn't actualize his talent, but he was somebody who, coming up through the ranks and through the juniors, a great boxer, he could take a big shot, and he was quick for such a big guy. And he wasn't afraid to brawl there either. But he had a couple of fights that he lost that he probably should have certainly given a better account of himself. And it's very difficult for non-fighters to even think in these terms, but this is what it appeared. For example, Leon Spinks kind of got embarrassed by Dwight Muhammad Cowie, the former Dwight Braxton, speaking of great light heavyweights, as Michael Spinks was a great light heavyweight. Spinks lost a really terrible fight to Dwight Cowie, somebody who Foreman beat. He beat him during his comeback on this sort of march to Jerry Cooney. That was a tough fight for George, but he figured, he outweighs him by probably 90 pounds. He should be able to win, and he did. Although Cowie did make George look dumb on a lot of occasions, because Cowie was a really crafty, clever defensive fighter. George went out there, though, and he walked right through Jerry Cooney. Fight was barely competitive. Cooney, he had his moments in the first round. He landed a big left hook. George kind of staggered a little bit, but I think he was just off balance before the punch landed. And second round, he just fucking crushed him. He obliterated him in the second round. And then people started to dream. We talk about the fantasy fights for real. People started imagining George Foreman versus Mike Tyson. People were looking for anybody who was even going to be competitive against Mike. And you look at his title defenses, the Tony Tucker fight was not an easy fight. And Bone Crusher Smith kind of shook him up a few times. Bone Crusher wasn't out there trying to... Bone Crusher he needed to go out there to try to knock Tyson out, and instead he went out there as if he just wanted to survive 12 rounds. If he had fought the way he did against Holmes, yeah, maybe he gets KO'd in the 6th round, but he would have put forth, I think, a better account of himself. You know, it's unfortunate because Bone Crusher was a big dude who could hit, and he certainly could take a big shot, as we saw in the Holmes fight, and to some extent to the Tyson fight. But Tyson had that aura of invincibility and the fear that he engendered, the kind of fear that Sonny Liston in the 60s and George in the early to mid 70s. Tyson had it in spades. People were afraid of him, and Mike even said, nobody wants to face me because I bring the pain. And Mike said a lot of funny shit in that era, but he wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong. So when George demolished Cooney, there was at least the idea, if they can't work out a fight with Holyfield, who already was, rising the ranks and had moved from cruiser, because he was an incredible cruiserweight, not surprisingly, maybe we can get a fight with the undefeated Evander and undefeated Mike Tyson. But then Buster Douglas happened. And the incredible talent of Buster Douglas on that one magical night, what was it, February 11th, 1990? It was something like that. I'm sorry I got the date wrong. But he put it all together on that night. And that is a real outlier fight in the sense that an all-time great in Tyson mostly got beat upside down and inside out for almost the entire fight. Almost ended in a Tyson win by knockout with that big booming uppercut that he landed at the end of the 8th round, a round that Buster was dominating, and Ray Leonard thought there was a chance that Mike was going to drop in that round, and then boom, Mike landed that incredible shot. He was already having trouble seeing. That's why I don't like when people say, well, Mike, did he have the same will? Yeah, he did. Not everybody is Frazier and Ali in Manila. Not everybody is George Foreman refusing to quit in the Alex Stewart fight in 92 when he had that weird reaction and his face blew up to twice the size. No, I'm not stopping. Let's fucking go. Not everybody can be that all the time. But Buster Douglas's defeat of Tyson, it almost doesn't make sense how easily he won that fight, with the exception of, obviously, the 8th round knockdown. But I think that Buster won 8 rounds. I think he won 7 or 8 rounds for sure. Mike just couldn't. He couldn't get going. He couldn't get anything going until the last, stages of round 8. So Evander got the first crack at Buster, and he beat him. He beat him easily. Buster was not the same Buster. He was heavier. He really didn't look that great. What was his trainer's name? Jim Johnson? Was it Jim Johnson or John Johnson? I'm not sure. It was somebody Johnson. And the word was leaking out that Buster wasn't training properly and he was eating, pizzas and ordering Dunkin' Donuts. I want to do that too, but Buster really should have taken it more seriously. But I understand, and he talked about this. I love Buster Douglas. Too much, too soon. Didn't know what to do with himself. He could have just retired. He could have done that. That would have been okay if he beat Tyson. How could you top beating Mike Tyson, right? The first guy to beat Tyson. But that's how George got a title shot. Evander needed an opponent, and George was deemed to be, for Evander, a safe opponent at that time. And you know what? Razor Ruddock would have been tough. He probably would have given Evander at least as tough a fight, if not tougher than Foreman. I don't think he would have beat him. Razor was really, really good. He was a big guy who could hit and he could take a big shot, but he wasn't quite at the top tier level. In my opinion, he certainly fought a lot of top tier guys almost to standstills. He fought Tyson real tough twice, and Mike was still very young, even though they were both, of course, after the Douglas fight. But George got the title shot with Evander because of Buster Douglas. It's so crazy to boil it all down to that, but that's literally how he got the title shot. Buster beating Mike, Evander beating Buster. Because I don't really think that if Buster Douglas somehow manages to defeat Evander or fights him to a standstill and there's no change of title, he's not getting a title shot against Douglas. Mike might get a return fight. Maybe Evander gets a return fight. I'm not seeing an angle. But people were excited when the fight was made. There were many in the business. Nobody wanted to rip George publicly, but there were a lot of people who said, this is ridiculous. Evander is so good and young, they could just wait until Mike is ready, meaning Tyson, or maybe if Buster wants a return fight, this is ridiculous. Whatever it was that was being said, there's a lot of quotes, of course, from the era from various people. But as a fan, I was 17 when this fight went off. I was excited because I already was something of a boxing historian, already something of an Ali scholar, even though I wasn't even in college yet. I was a year and a half away from college at that point. But I was excited. And when I found out that Angelo Dundee was going to work with George, I was excited for that too, because that was Ali's guy. That was Sugar Ray Leonard's guy, that famous after round 12 when Leonard is suddenly way behind on points against Thomas Hearns, and he has the end swell on Ray's eye. You're blowing it now, son. You're blowing it. And damned if Ray Leonard didn't come out there invigorated and just beat the crap out of a phenomenal fighter in Thomas Hearns. And he ended up winning that fight. But Dundee said, I think George is going to win. This is not a novelty. And I've seen too much in boxing to not believe this is the kind of thing that happens in boxing. When you say this person can't win, but you know they have the talent to do it even at his age. So unfortunately, I did not see this fight live. It was on pay-per-view, and my mom was a big boxing fan, and she used to get the pay-per-view events at home. But on this particular night, she went to the home of friends. I was still living in Massapequa at the time, obviously. But she went to someone's home and watched the fight, so I didn't get to see it at home. But when I read in the paper the next day and watched, ESPN and saw the highlights, I was just happy that George acquitted himself well. I didn't really think he was going to win, but I'm glad, and history is glad, that the fight went 12. And if you look at the scorecards, I think, were overly generous to George. One of the judges, I believe it was Jerry Roth, but again, I'm not 100% on that. They had it 115 to 112 for Evander. I think the scores were 116, 111, 117, 112, 115. 117 to 110, 115 to 112. The HBO broadcast had the fight as more of a rout than I think it was. Bob Sheridan, I believe, did the European call, as he sometimes did in that era. He had it more balanced. He thought it was a 9-3 or 8-4 fight. I think the guys on HBO, the Jim Lampley and Larry Merchant, who ended up, of course, working with George in later years, they had the fight way more one-sided than a lot of people. But it's neither here nor there in the sense that nobody disputes that Evander won the decision cleanly. This was not a disputed, this was not Pernell Whitaker or Oscar De La Hoya where the scorecards are all over the place, or if you want to go back even further, the second fight with Ken Norton and Muhammad Ali, I always say Ali fights were impossible to score because of the way he moved around the ring and played to the crowd and could build up points with the kind of pitter-pat that he would do. The Norton-Ali fight, one of the judges gave the fight to Ken. The referee, I think, had Ali winning by 2 rounds. And then the third scorecard was something like 8-1 Ali with 3 even. It was something stupid. It was, how could this be the same? And there were a couple of moments, especially in the 5th round, where it looked like there was a chance Evander could stop him. But George just wasn't going to go. He wasn't going to yield. And we know he took an incredible shot. And even as he kind of stumbled around the ring, he was still looking to land his home run punch. Unfortunately, I don't think that George's best shots, I don't think that he takes out Evander Holyfield. That the shot that he defeated Michael Moorer with to regain the title 3.5 years later, I don't know that Evander walks through it, but that's not ending the fight. There is nothing in Evander's entire career to indicate that he would not have walked through that shot from George, as big a hitter as he is. And as much as Evander has even recently talked about it when George passed, people love the story, where he says towards the end of a round, I think it might have been the 7th, he said, George hit me so hard I froze as the bell rang. I stood, and you could see it on the clip that I saw on YouTube. Evander was telling the story not that long ago, and then they show the clip where he does seem to freeze. He said, he hit me so hard I froze. I mean, I guess he's lucky he didn't get knocked down, right? He said, I froze. And when I went back to the corner, I asked my cornerman, are my teeth still here? I think he knocked out all of my teeth. Evander is not really a natural storyteller, but the way he tells that story in a kind of matter-of-fact way, I was fucking dying. That is great, a great story. He didn't knock all of his teeth out, but that's what Evander, that's how hard he hit him. And to this day, Evander, I don't think he's just, saying this because people want to hear it. He said, I think George was the hardest hitter I ever got in there with. And you could only imagine what it would have been like if he got in there with the 1973 George, who not only threw cleaner shots, although George still threw those, Ali used to call him the anywhere punch. George would just windmill. He would windmill punches at his opponents. But he had the ability to be very clean and very crisp. But sometimes just wanted to get his. And it just seemed that it was going to be over for him. And then Michael Moorer and George, he continued on even after the Morrison fight. But I on that fight, the knockdown early for Evander, I feel like is a little bit like the difference. But Moorer got that decision, and similar to Evander taking on George for a first title defense, let's go. Michael Moorer versus George Foreman. And history tells us that Michael Moorer fought Foreman better for 9 rounds. He was even sharper than Evander, because Evander took some heavy fire from George. And as I said, some of the shots that Evander ate in that fight, I don't think that Michael Moorer is still standing there. I think that George would have taken him out earlier, but Michael Moorer was a really good boxer because of some of the ways that he lost and the fact that he lost the fight to Foreman, that he was probably ahead either 8-1 or 9-0. He's kind of underrated. He was more of a natural cruiserweight even than Evander. There are some people who take longer to develop into what they're going to become. But Michael Moorer was a really good boxer. He was a southpaw who could fight conventional. His footwork was impeccable. He didn't take shots the way Evander did. Who did? I mean, what other guy the size of Evander Holyfield could walk through the Mike Tyson power shots the way he did in '96? I mean, Mike threw some fucking howitzers in that fight, and Evander ate them and just kept moving forward. And that's got to be tough, especially when you hit the way Tyson did at the time. That you square your guy up, and this is the same combination that put Frank Bruno out, and Evander is saying, that's right, Mike, let's fucking go. I think maybe I would, check please, waitress, like that. I don't want any part of this guy's fucking crazy. He's just telling me to let's fucking go. Jeez. But because Moorer won the title, and let's fight George Foreman, it's the kind of thing that fans wanted, and I was excited. I didn't think George had a chance. When you watch the first 9 rounds, George lands a couple of punches, but he's not able to do anything of real oomph. He doesn't land anything of consequence. More or less boxed circles around him. He fought smart. Evander was willing to mix it up. You could say that Evander didn't necessarily fight the smartest fight against George, but thing with Evander, he could do more than one thing in a fight. And speaking of the Tyson fight in '96, the announcers for that fight, Ferdy Pacheco being one of them, and Bobby Ches and Steve Albert, they kept talking about the fact that Evander is mixing it up too much. It's not his fight to stand and trade with Tyson. But by the 9th round, Ferdy Pacheco says the obvious when Bobby Ches said the slugfest ensues, it's not Evander's fight, but he's winning. Pacheco says, Evander's been doing this all night. I'm not so sure that this isn't his fight. But Evander walked into the line of fire against George and survived. Moorer didn't do that. You watch the first 9 rounds, and he puts on a fucking clinic. It's beautiful boxing. I mean, you can't do it any better. You can't beat a huge puncher any better than what Moorer did. He was limiting George from really loading up. He was staying out of range. As much as his trainer, Teddy Atlas, was busting his balls in the corner, I think that he was fighting a really great fight. But Teddy kept saying, don't stand in front of him. You got to keep moving. Moorer, a nice guy. You interview him. He seems like a regular guy. But we don't know what really beats in the heart and mind of somebody at this level of this brutal sport. And maybe Michael Moorer thought that he was going to knock George out or had a chance or should at least try to do something other than win a dull decision. Now, he wasn't trying to get hit, but he stopped moving. It's not because he was tired. He stopped circling. He stopped moving away from George's power because George was less likely to take him out with a left hook. He stopped moving, and Teddy Atlas was yelling at him to move, and that's when George dropped the fucking bomb hammer on him, which didn't really look like a loaded punch. Now, I'm lucky enough. I saw that fight live. It was broadcast on HBO, not even pay-per-view. It was on HBO live on a Saturday night. It was November 5th. And when that punch got through the guard, I could see that it landed, but it was a syntax error. It didn't make sense that Moorer was going down because it didn't look like a loaded punch, but he happened to just catch him exactly right. And there are certain times that a guy just gets hit. And, you know, as George even said in the Ron Lyle fight, which was actually, he took the most punishment in that fight in his first go-around. I forgot about that. But he says sometimes you get hit so hard it doesn't even hurt. And George almost laughing about that he was able to get up the final time against Lyle and turn the fight around. And he made it seem that, well, it didn't even hurt, so of course I was going to get up. Like, oh yeah, this is great. But the shot that Foreman won the title from Moorer on got through the gum shield. I think he shattered his gum shield. And he basically chopped his lip. He cut the guy's lip in such a way that I'm telling you, that must have hurt beyond imagination. Think of the nerve endings in the mouth. Like, I can't even believe. That is how knocked out Michael Moorer was in that moment. Because that would have the normal person, that level of cut lip, would have someone screaming in pain. And the fact that Moorer, it wasn't until presumably that he came to that he realized, you look at him in the post-fight news conference, oh my God, George hit him so much harder than it appeared. It just looked like a straight right. He didn't even really load up. He leaned into the punch, but we've seen Foreman deliver blows that look way more powerful than that. But it was the only one he needed. One quick shot, boom, right up the pike, fight's over. Buster Douglas and Michael Moorer, the two key guys, ironically, in George Foreman and Evander Holyfield even getting to fight, getting to have a kind of fantasy fight for real, and George Foreman getting another crack at the title when most people thought that he should have been retired. And I am sad that George is gone. He wasn't really that old. Was he 76? Not that old. And Ali only made it to 74. And Smokin' Joe, I think, did Joe even make it to 70? Joe died in Joe died in 2011, if memory serves. I think it was 2011. Joe didn't even make it to 70. It's sad. And we know that Ray Robinson struggled towards the end, and a lot of other great fighters. Joe Louis was not really in good health towards the end. A lot of things went wrong for Joe financially. Very, very sad. And George Foreman somehow seemed to live the life that he wanted to when he retired, and not just because of all the money he made for himself and for his quite large family with the grills. He just was a galvanizing presence. He had two acts. Young George was this fearsome dreadnought, this scary, intimidating personality. And old George was, to paraphrase Roger Ebert, he was the cutest, cuddliest, cold-blooded killer that any one of us would never want to meet inside the squared circle. This has been episode 492 of the Confessions of a Not-So-Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Saturday evening here with me in New York. And if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then.